To be honest, by the end of the book, I didn't trust Gallagher at all. I didn't trust that she was knowledgeable enough about the area to be writing a book about it. And I didn't trust that she was telling me things that would weaken her own argument. And to be honest, I just didn't trust her in general.
You're watching Gript Media. Here in the studio with me, I have our Deputy Editor, Gary Kavanagh, and we're going to discuss Aoife Gallagher's new book, Web of Lies. Gary, you read through the book and you had some things to say about it. Who is Aoife Gallagher, for people who don't know?
So Aoife Gallagher is a research analyst with a group called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. They're an anti-extremism think tank. They're very involved with governments across Europe. They've been a growing presence over the last number of years. They're a relatively recent organisation. They only started, I think, about 15 or so years ago. But that's her day job. And then previously she worked for Storyful, which was Mark Little, currently of Kinson's company. So she's been a fixture around the Irish media space for a number of years. But this is her first book.
So does she have any kind of significant research background, or?
Well, I mean, she works as a research analyst, so you would kind of hope that that would imply someone is good at research. Having read the book, that's not the case. She's not. Although I must say that this is her first book, and it would seem to be something she's not quite used to. So it may be that, you know, this could have been a good book if there had been a bit of a firmer editorial hand on it.
And the book is intended as a piece of research about the supposed rise of the far right, is that correct?
So it's intended to explain conspiratorial thinking. Now, I mean, if you look at the title of it, it doesn't reference the far right, but on the blurb and most of the promotional material, it says it focuses only on the far right. And that's actually a big problem with the book, that it makes kind of grand sweeping claims about the nature of conspiratorial thinking, but then only focuses on a very narrow type of conspiratorial thinking. And even when sources are used that also explain various left-wing conspiracies, she just doesn't go into those or bring them up at all. So you're left with this exceptionally one-sided view of conspiratorial thinking, where you might read it and think that these are the only types of conspiracies that exist, and these are the only types of people that could fall for them. And just, it's a massive gap in the actual book itself.
And in your review, you touched on issues like the Irish Freedom Party and her statements about Herman Kelly. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Herman Kelly and the Irish Freedom Party come up a lot throughout the book in different parts of it. But there's a section of it where she references a comment that Herman Kelly made about how the Irish Freedom Party has policies to support women having more children and support stay-at-home parents. And then she references what are called the 14 words, which are a neo-Nazi white nationalist slogan about how we must support the white birth rate and how we must promote having more white children. And then the sentence after it is there an echo in here? I swear I can hear an echo. And it's stuff like that, kind of very clearly implying that Herman Kelly is a white nationalist, but doesn't have the willingness to actually come out and say, I think he's a white nationalist and here is the evidence. Instead, there's just, I'm going to imply this about you, and it probably won't cross into defamation because I'll say it was, not exactly what I meant.
But it's quite insincere from a kind of a research point of view.
Well, I think the question about all these books, particularly when you have someone who has very particular political views, as Aoife Gallagher does, is, are they writing this as a fairly dispassionate, scholarly exercise, or are they going to try and promote their own views and take pot shots at their opponents? And I think that piece about Herman shows that when given the chance, Gallagher is always going to take the shot at her political opponent. And it means you can't trust what she's saying.
This might be a good time to bring up her 2020 run-in with the Burkean.
Yeah, so the Burkean did a bit of a sting operation on various left-wing figures in Ireland. And they called them pretending to be anti-fascist activists. And they asked a load of people on the Irish left, would they be willing to pass information to the Burkean, or to the group the Burkean were impersonating? Would they be willing to physically confront fascists? And Gallagher was one of those people involved. Now, Gallagher was asked, would she pass information from her job to this group on the understanding that this group would turn it into a public database that left-wing activists would have access to. And Gallagher said, I think her initial response is something like, yeah, no bother.
They wanted to dox people who she believed were far-right or far-right sympathisers.
Gallagher in that seems to be saying that she will give doxing information to a group who will then publish it without notifying people that she's involved. Now, this would have been the time when she was working for Storyful, so she would have been involved in investigations and fact-checking and things like that. So information would have come across her desk that might have related to these matters. But yes, effectively, she seems to be saying she was willing to give information that she got in her professional capacity to a group purely for the purpose of doxing people she thought was far right. Now, there's no evidence that she ever did that. And I mean, she may have just been, saying, yeah, with no intention of giving them, because we can't say because it didn't happen. But if you've got someone on tape who's saying they're willing to do this, then writing a book about the far right, there's immediately a question of, well, are you a fair dealer here? Or is this just you taking pot shots at your opponents?
Gallagher brings up a lot of American politics in the book. Can you tell us about what she said about the Republican Party versus the RNC?
Yeah, so she brings up a lot of points on American politics, but the sense I get is that she doesn't know a lot about American politics. She makes statements about everything from the Red Scare to McCarthyism to the siege of Waco that they're not wrong per se, but they're not right either. They're not the sort of thing that someone who knows what they're talking about would say. Or they might be the sort of thing someone who knows what they're talking about would say if they didn't want to give you the full picture of what had happened. So in relation to the Republican Party, there's a section of the book which appears to be taken directly from the Southern Poverty Law Centre report without reference, as in with no note that it came from the Southern Poverty Law Centre. And that references things to the Republican Party, but the original report references them to the Republican National Committee, which is an entirely different organisation. But I don't think Gallagher realised they were different organisations, so she just says the Republican Party says it. And the quotes are also, one of the quotes used is incorrect. So it's very clear that Gallagher took the quote from the report rather than going back to see what the Republicans had actually said about it. So you have things like that. There's other weird things in it, like she's talking about the Red Scare in America during the 40s and the 50s, and she says that the reaction to it was overblown. Now, this is a page after, maybe 2 pages after, she talked about how the Soviets acquired nuclear weapon secrets from the Americans. I would probably argue that if they're stealing nuclear weapon secrets from you, you should probably be pretty wary about them. Although even there, she doesn't quite give the same story. In a single sentence, she talks about the Soviets getting nuclear weapon secrets, and then a couple called the Rosenbergs, who were executed for spying. And she mentions them in the same sentence, but she doesn't actually explain why the Rosenbergs were sentenced for spying, and they were sentenced for spying and executed because it was claimed they'd passed nuclear secrets to the Soviets.
Which you would think would be relevant to the...
And you could say, because they're in the same sentence, maybe she was implying that those two things were linked, but she never says it, she just kind of throws it away. And if you didn't know about it, well then it just kind of sounds like these two people were executed randomly. And then there's stuff like, she's talking about McCarthyism and Joe McCarthy, and she says he died of suspected alcoholism, which is not a medical diagnosis. Nor is it certain. McCarthy was a very heavy drinker, particularly at the end of his life, because his career was totally ruined and he kind of fell into a pit of alcoholism. And there's been a debate about whether or not he died due to cirrhosis of the liver or something like that. But there were multiple things wrong with him by the end of his life. And it's not known for certain because the family said they didn't want an autopsy performed. Which is again to say that saying he died of suspected alcoholism without reference is maybe not the most accurate thing to say. But McCarthy is not a very popular figure on the left, and the left are very fond of saying he died of issues related to his alcoholism. So it again doesn't really surprise me that that's where she's gone with it. But again, there's no evidence to support it. She doesn't reference to anyone. She just makes the statement and moves on. And that is a consistent theme throughout this book. Make the statement, move on. It's clearly true.
Coming back to the topic of Waco, there's obviously like a huge body of research about that topic. How does Gallagher discuss it?
So the first thing is Gallagher correctly positions the siege of Waco in that she says that it's pivotal to the militia movement in America. And she's right on that. It is an incredibly, incredibly important thing in the development of the militia movement and some of the more feisty anti-government elements in America. So then she says it's incredibly important, and then there is a paragraph on it. And then she moves on to Timothy McVeigh.
A single paragraph?
Single paragraph.
Okay. And
it is the strangest paragraph because she mentions the siege, says it happened in 1993, Branch Davidians even, and then says, and at the end of the siege, a fire broke out and killed X amount of adults and Y amount of children. And this showed the government that they were unable to deal with groups like the Branch Davidians. And then she moves on. But it's kind of like what I was saying about the Soviets, where she brings up the Rosenbergs, but doesn't mention about the atomic spying part. So here she says that, and then I think she says something like, the siege convinced the militia groups that the government was out to get them, and moves on. Doesn't say why the siege convinced the militia groups the government was out to get them. And this is important because it's a massive thing. The fire that started, different people give different reasons for the fire. The FBI said the Branch Davidians started it. But when you look at polling on the topic, and as we move further from the actual siege, the polling is becoming more extreme with what people believe. A large amount of people, and not just the militia movement, but a large amount of Americans believe the fire was set either deliberately or accidentally by the FBI. And that due to that, the FBI burned children alive, although the ATF is usually blamed for that part. That's why the militia movement thought the government was out to get them, because they believed the government had burned down the Branch Davidian compound. The FBI, obviously this matter is still up in the air, but the FBI initially said that they had used no incendiary devices at all in the siege. Now that later turned out to be incorrect, and the FBI changed their story to saying that, well, we had used them but not in the places the fire started and not in the time scale where they could have been blamed for the fire. But there has been a movement from, no, we didn't use them at all, to okay, we did, but not like that. It's not our fault still. So all of this is missing from Gallagher's book. If you read the book, you just know a fire started, children died, and it went bad. No one came out of it well. But you don't actually understand anything about the siege.
So reading the book, you'd actually have to go off and do your own research again to try and find out what exactly she's talking about. Yeah, and that's one of the consistent things in this book. It will mention things, but because it doesn't give the other side or it doesn't give any detail, you actually have to go off and look at it, or you need to know something about it beforehand to realise that it doesn't really fit with the arguments Gallagher is making, or it fits, but you just don't know a lot about the topic. And this is particularly weird because she highlights how important it is, and then you have 3 lines on it and you're gone. It's not a short book. The book is, I think, about 330 pages long, and there are pages of it just devoted to trivial nonsense, things that didn't need to be there. So I think that, again, because this is her first book, I think really that Guild Publishing should have just been a lot more on the ball and should have just had a sort of, that doesn't need to be there, maybe expand these sections. It's very weird because in some issues, or in some areas, I think it's deliberate, that there's a deliberate omission of information to strengthen her argument. But in stuff like that, I don't know if it's that she just doesn't know a lot about the siege, other than that it was important, or if she just didn't think it was important to let people know. But if it's the latter, why would you begin the section by talking about how important it is and then not tell people about it? And on that note, she also talks about cancer patients and complementary medicine, saying those that had taken complementary medicine were twice as likely to die.
Yeah, so she does. And this is, I think, one of the best examples of how Gallagher approaches research in this book. She references that, and that is actually one of the few things in the book which is appropriately referenced. But when I went to see it, there was a substantial debate about methodological flaws in that study. And even the authors themselves said that they had made some errors in weighting it, but none of that is mentioned. And the question there is it that she didn't know that these issues existed, or is it that she knew these issues existed but knew talking about it makes her point weaker because she's at that point talking about the harm of conspiracy theories and so didn't bring it up, deliberately omitting it. Neither is a particularly good thing, because either she didn't research it sufficiently or she's being dishonest.
She also talks in the book about Pizzagate.
Yes, Pizzagate, which is a very difficult one to explain. Effectively, it was the belief that there was a pedophile ring involved in the Clinton administration, with high-ranking people associated with it. And she quotes from a survey which is talking about how many Trump voters believed Pizzagate to be right. And she kind of presents it as this, look how deranged these people are. But what she doesn't mention is that the survey also looked at belief in Pizzagate amongst the general public and amongst Hillary Clinton supporters. And it turns out it's not just the Republicans who believe this to be correct, it's a massive amount of just the general American population, including 17% of Hillary Clinton voters, which, if 17% of your voters believe that there is a pedophile ring amongst your aides and are still willing to vote for you, that says something about politics in the country. But none of that is mentioned, nor is it mentioned that the same survey looked at the amount of Democrats who believed that the Russians had interfered in the election to help Donald Trump win, and not by misinformation or anything like that, but it legitimately disrupted or hacked into voting machines to change the results. There was a massive amount of Clinton supporters who believed that, something which appears to be a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory. But none of that is mentioned, even where, if you're interested in the idea of conspiratorial thinking and how people come to believe these things, you would think that 17% of a candidate's own voters believing a pedophile ring in her own camp would be interesting. Or you might mention about the Russians interfering, because then you can show that the conspiracy theories on both the right and the left in America and what it relates to. But Gallagher isn't interested in that. It's not even worth mentioning to you. And as I said, that's a consistent theme. If there is something that doesn't directly relate to what she is talking about and help strengthen it, she just doesn't tell you about it.
So it's just she's engaging in confirmation bias then
By the end of it, so there's always a question of, is this that someone is not aware of these findings, or they're just not bringing them up for whatever reason? And from reading it, I didn't get the sense that she is a very deep researcher. Like some of the sources that are used, like the one about cancer, there are other sources that could back her up on that, better sources, but she doesn't use them. So you kind of get the feeling that certain sources are used because she just looked into an area, found something that agreed with her, and used it. So sometimes like that, where she may have a point, she just doesn't use the strongest thing to support herself, and I suspect because she doesn't know enough about the area to determine what's actually the strongest.
And in your review, you said that one of the most difficult parts of doing it was actually choosing what to focus on. What are some of the more interesting things that you might have left out of the review that you might talk to us?
So there were a number of things that were quite interesting. There were questionable statements, and there were also statements she made about herself in the introductory, where she's talking about how she was very influenced by things like Zeitgeist and Alex Jones. And there's a question there of, does that pattern indicate that the author is someone who is open to conspiratorial thinking, and rather than getting to grips with that, she's now gone into an area where she can engage in conspiratorial thinking but be supported by other people? So you can start talking about how the far right is everywhere, and it's slowly growing and influencing things, and everything is employed by the far right, and people will say that's a sane and responsible thing. But it's still, in many forms, very similar to other types of conspiratorial thinking. It's just socially accepted. And I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there about the author. But then it really just depends on what topic. So there's a section on Gamergate, for instance. And she makes statements there about how certain things were proven to be false. And you're like, that's not quite what happened there. It's important to actually say this. Most of the stuff in the book isn't false as such. It can be incorrect, but it is usually a half-truth. It's giving one side and not giving the other, and then just presenting it as if the side you've given is absolutely correct, because there's no alternative to it noted. And that's just consistent throughout the book.
You also mentioned in your review an ISD presentation that was given at Leinster House and how Aoife Gallagher was one of the speakers at that, and she presented some incorrect information on LGBT issues.
Yeah, she did. If I remember correctly, she said that there was absolutely no scientific debate about something, which there was absolutely scientific debate about. And I wrote an article on it, calling the ISD out. I didn't mention the author in that article because it didn't seem to be any point to focus on the person rather than the ISD. But yeah, it was absolutely acclaimed by this author. And that comes up in the book because she uses the study I brought up to rebut her point. She mentions it, but then she critiques it. And that's also how this book works. She gives two studies, one that supports her, one that goes against her, the one that I brought up originally. She critiques the one that goes against her and doesn't mention the one she's in support of. She doesn't mention any of the methodological issues with that. And that's pretty much how the book works. So if it's something she disagrees with, and usually it won't get mentioned at all, but to the extent it is, it'll be critiqued and presented as flawed. Anything that agrees with her is presented as absolutely correct.
And can you talk to us about the Peter Tatchell connection?
Yeah, so she says that Peter Tatchell, she's talking about the issues with Roderick O'Gorman and the troubles there. And she's saying that he got in trouble for standing beside Peter Tatchell, the veteran LGBT campaigner, and then says that Peter Tatchell had become a figure of controversy because of statements he had made, and then just says that he has repeatedly said that those statements were taken out of context or something like that. She doesn't really, it's presented in the most benign way possible. But what actually happened there was that Peter Tatchell had written a letter, in fact 2 letters, to The Guardian in support of a book which was largely about pedophilia. And in it he made a couple of statements about age of consent laws, which he subsequently argued were taken out of context, but when actually you view the full letter, it's actually, they're quite clearly in context. And then a lot more had turned up about Thatchell after. I wrote a very, very long article about it where I found he was also, he had written a chapter in a book edited by one of the high-ranking members of the pedophile information of PI. He had written the obituary of another chap involved with the pedophile information exchange. There was a long string of stuff about Thatchell and age of consent. And it just, to say that, his words were taken out of context and then he had clarified it, just in no way gives you an idea of what had actually happened. But again, Thatchell is someone on side. So he gets the softest of all possible approaches, and she doesn't even explain, she doesn't even give what the words that were apparently taken out of context are in the book. So you're left with nothing but her word that, this is fine, there's no issue here, let's all move on. And again, that is the consistent theme of this book. Ideas are not presented equally. Ideas she agrees with are obviously right and are presented in the strongest possible form with no criticism, and anything that disagrees with her is either not there or is heavily critiqued.
And you submitted a media query about the SPLC statement that appears in the book. What did the publishers say to you about that?
They said it was a referencing error which would be rectified immediately, but that there was no question of plagiarism as she hasn't presented it as her own work. Unfortunately for Gallagher, what she actually did was there's 2 quotes from the SPLC and then there's a sentence between them. And she took both the quotes and the sentence. And as I said, one of the quotes is incorrect. So it's clear to me that that came from the report and was lifted. Now, whether or not you think that constitutes plagiarism is a different matter. Even if it is, it seems relatively minor. But again, it's the sort of thing you would think a publisher would have an eye out, particularly for a first-time author who might make mistakes that others wouldn't, but they don't seem to have noticed. But yes, I sent that media query in the day the book was out, and so the book was out less than a day before the publishers came back to say that there was an error substantial enough to require immediate rectification.
But it somehow passed under their gaze?
Yes. Yeah, they didn't notice at all. And I only noticed because I thought the quote was odd, because I am relatively familiar with the American political system, particularly the Republican Party, and you know, when you see something and you're like, I have a vague memory of that, but it's not quite this. And then when I looked into it, I was like, oh, this is the SPLC. And probably worth mentioning, the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Centre, for years was a very kind of prestigious and trusted organisation in America. And over the last 15 years, it's kind of tanked its own reputation. And now the Republicans won't deal with it because they say it's putting basic right-leaning organisations and putting them down as hate groups. And interestingly, the person who's usually blamed for that was the author of the report that Gallagher uses. So you wouldn't, even someone who didn't know enough about the topic, but who knew about the SPLC, should have seen the name of the author of the report and immediately realised this is something we should actually look into. Like, you want to confirm this source. This person, I would say, is not trustworthy. But they didn't.
And in the intro to the book, you talked about how Gallagher addresses her critics.
Mm-hmm.
What did she say to them about Bill Gates, George Soros?
She says, I think the very last line of the intro it's something like, to all those who are reading this because they think I'm a pawn of British intelligence, of Bill Gates or George Soros, thanks for reading. And it's clearly a joke, but it's also kind of a poke at people who are concerned about the ISD, because the ISD does have a lot of involvement with the British state. It's not surprising considering its founder, or at least one of its founders. They've received money from George Soros. They've received money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So these are all legitimate conflicts of interest. But of course, you kind of present the people who are concerned about these things as kind of nutters. Or
conspiracy theorists.
Yeah. And you just sort of negate them, which is, had a little bit less time been spent on that and a bit more time spent on, research, the book could have actually been good. Because there are parts of the book that are interesting. It's just that when you're talking about conspiracy theories, one of the core things you're actually talking about is trust. How much trust people have in other people, in institutions, things like that. Because you lose trust in institutions, you tend to start believing a lot of very odd things because you kind of move away from those institutional truths. And you would think that Gallagher, being a researcher into that and knowing that, would try and act in as trustworthy a manner as possible. But I mean, stuff like that doesn't help her, particularly given how shoddy the rest of the research in the book is. In the same way, like she says in the book, in the interest of transparency, I think she notes that the Open Society has given money to the ISD. She fails to note that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has also given money to the ISD, but she at least gets one of them. But stuff like that, you should be upfront about all of your conflicts of interests, even if they are only minor ones, in order to build trust. And to be honest, by the end of the book, I didn't trust Gallagher at all. I didn't trust that she was knowledgeable enough about the area to be writing a book about it. And I didn't trust that she was telling me things that would weaken her own argument. And to be honest, I just didn't trust her in general. Because consistently throughout the book, she acts in manners, in a fashion which is not trustworthy, either because she doesn't know or because she's biased. And I'm kind of surprised that Gilbook published the book as is, because a good editor should have seen most of these issues, should have seen most of these sourcing difficulties, and should have seen that Gallagher perhaps needs a co-author, someone who could disagree with her gently and could have pulled the book a bit back to the centre. And that would have helped the book amazingly. Like, she's not a bad writer. The issues are editorial and, I would say, the trustworthiness of Gallagher.